Welcome back to the Hearth, travelers. You are listening to the Folklord. Tonight, we step back in time to the early 19th century into the rugged, superstitious hills of Robertson County, Tennessee. Most hauntings are fleeting. A door slams, a shadow flickers, a cold breeze passes through a hallway. But what happened to the Bell family between 1817 and 1821 was something else entirely. This wasn't a haunting, it was a siege. It was a 4-year campaign of psychological and physical domestic terror carried out by an entity that possessed a voice, a physical presence, and a murderous intent. This is the true, documented account of the Bell Witch. In 1804, John Bell, a stern, hard-working farmer, and a deacon in the local church, moved his family from North Carolina to a 320-acre farm along the Red River in Tennessee. For 13 years, the Bells lived the American dream. They were wealthy, respected, and their children were healthy. But the frontier is a strange place. The land they farmed sat near ancient burial mounds and deep, unexplored limestone caverns. In the summer of 1817, the air on the Bell farm began to change. The birds stopped singing in the afternoons. The dogs, usually eager to hunt, began to cower under the porch. The silence of the Red River was about to be broken. It all began in the cornfield. John Bell was walking his rows late one afternoon when he saw something sitting between the stalks. He stopped, thinking it was a stray dog or perhaps a wolf. But as he approached, his blood turned to ice. The creature had the body of a large dog, but the head was that of a rabbit. It sat perfectly still, staring at him with eyes that didn't belong to any animal he had ever seen. John raised his gun and fired. The creature didn't yelp. It didn't bleed. It simply vanished into the air like a puff of smoke. Days later, his son, Drury, spotted a massive bird, a turkey of extraordinary size, perched on a fence. When he went to strike it, the bird took flight. But as it flew over him, it seemed to grow and shift, its wings making no sound against the wind. These were the warning shots. The entity was testing the perimeter of their reality. The phenomena soon moved inside the home. It started with a scratching sound against the exterior logs of the cabin, as if a giant beast were trying to claw its way in. Then came the gnawing. John and his wife, Lucy, would lie awake for hours, listening to the sound of invisible teeth grinding against the bedposts. They tried to ignore it. They told themselves it was rats or the house settling. But then the blankets began to move. Middle-of-the-night screams began common in the Bell household. The children would wake up, terrified, claiming their covers were being pulled off by invisible hands. Soon the sounds evolved into a heavy, wet slapping on the floorboards, the sound of a tongue licking the air. Then came the choking. It sounded like someone was standing in the corner of the room, gasping for air, drowning in their own lungs. The family was exhausted, terrified, and isolated. John Bell, a man of pride, forbade his children from telling the neighbors. He believed he could pray it away. He was wrong. By 1818, the entity grew tired of noises. It wanted contact. The youngest daughter, Betsy Bell, became the primary target. While she slept, her hair would be pulled so violently she would be lifted off the bed. Invisible hands would slap her across the face, leaving red welts that the family could see manifesting in real time. John Bell himself began to suffer. He developed a strange affliction, a swelling of the tongue that made it impossible for him to speak or eat. He felt a constant poking in his throat, as if a needle were being driven into his jaw. It was no longer just a ghost. It was an intelligent, malicious force that seemed to take joy in the suffering of the innocent. And soon, the entity would do something that shocked the entire frontier. It began to speak. At first, the voice was a low whistle or a muffled whisper, like someone reciting scripture in a distant room. But within weeks, it became a clear, feminine voice. When asked who it was, the entity gave various answers, but the one that stuck in local lore was Kate Batts, a neighbor whom John Bell had allegedly cheated in a land deal. Kate didn't just haunt the house, she participated in it. She would quote the Sunday sermons back to John Bell, mocking his faith. She would sing hymns in a beautiful, terrifying soprano. She knew the secrets of every neighbor within 20 miles, screaming their private sins out loud for anyone in the house to hear. The news spread. The Bell Farm became the most famous and feared location in the South. Even future President Andrew Jackson heard of the rumors. In 1819, he decided to see for himself if the witch was real. He was a man who had faced British bayonets and frontier duels, and he didn't believe in ghosts. He was about to be humbled. Word of the Bell Witch didn't just stay in the valley of the Red River. It traveled through the taverns and churches of Tennessee until it reached the ears of a man not known for his patience with nonsense, General Andrew Jackson. In 1819, the future President of the United States, a hero of the Battle of New Orleans, decided to see this frontier ghost for himself. He traveled toward the Bell Farm with a wagon, several horses, and a group of hardened men. Jackson was heard joking along the way, boasting that his men would smoke out whatever prankster was bothering the deacon. But as the party reached the edge of the Bell property, something happened that stopped the general in his tracks. The heavy supply wagon, pulled by a team of strong horses, suddenly ground to a halt. There were no rocks in the road. The wheels weren't stuck in the mud. The horses strained, their muscles bulging, their hooves digging into the dirt, but the wagon wouldn't budge an inch. Jackson's men climbed down, examining the wheels. They tried to push, but it was as if the wagon had become a permanent part of the earth. In the middle of the frustration, a metallic mocking rang out from the bushes. "All right, General, let the wagon move on. I will see you again tonight." As soon as the voice finished, the horses surged forward with such ease that the wagon nearly tipped. Jackson, a man who had stared down British bayonets, stood in the road, stunned. He looked at his men and said, "By the Eternal, boys, this is the witch." Jackson stayed at the Bell home that night. He wanted a confrontation. Well, he got one. One of the men in Jackson's party claimed to be a witch tamer. He carried a heavy pistol loaded with a silver bullet, boasting that no spirit could withstand it. As the family and the guests sat around the hearth in the flickering candlelight, the room suddenly turned ice cold. The tamer stood up, aiming his pistol at the shadows in the corner. Before he could pull the trigger, he began to scream. Witnesses said it looked as if an invisible giant was pummeling the man. He was slapped, kicked, and eventually poked with what he described as 1,000 needles. The entity's voice shrieked with laughter, ordering the men to leave. He fled into the night, terrified and bleeding. Jackson was fascinated. He reportedly stayed up all night, hoping to see more. By the next morning, however, the general was leading his men away from the farm in a hurry. When asked why he didn't stay longer, he famously remarked, "I would rather fight the entire British Army than face the Bell Witch again." While the general could leave, the Bells were trapped. As 1820 began, the entity, now calling itself Kate, focused its full malicious attention on Betsy Bell. Betsy was a beautiful young woman, and she had recently become engaged to a local man named Joshua Gardner. For reasons known only to the spirit, Kate hated this union. Every time Joshua came to visit, the house became a war zone. Heavy furniture would fly across the room the moment Joshua sat down. Betsy would be slapped until her face was bruised, and the spirit would scream in her ears for hours, "Don't marry Joshua Gardner. You shall not have him." The psychological toll was devastating. Imagine trying to fall in love while an invisible, screaming force follows you into every room, revealing your most private thoughts and physically assaulting you in front of your suitor. Kate began to claim that Betsy was vile and unfit, dragging the poor girl's reputation through the mud in front of the entire community. But as Betsy's spirit was being broken, her father's body was being destroyed. John Bell was no longer the strong patriarch who had settled the Red River. He was a shell of a man. The entity had moved beyond simple pranks. It began to take credit for John's deteriorating health. Whenever John walked outside, he would be tripped by invisible feet. He would wake up with his face distorted, his muscles twitching uncontrollably. The poking in his throat had become so severe that he could barely swallow water. Kate began to curse him openly, calling him Old Jack, and screaming that she would torment him to the grave. She would sit in the rafters of the barn and mock his prayers, telling him that his God couldn't hear him over her voice. The neighbors, once skeptical, and now flocked to the farm to witness the horror. They saw John Bell's tongue swell until it turned black. They heard the spirit predict future events with 100% accuracy. They realized they weren't just watching a haunting. They were watching a slow-motion execution. The year was drawing to a close, and the Bell Witch was preparing for her final act. By December of 1820, the Bell Farm was no longer a place of life. The air in the house felt heavy, charged with a static tension that made the hair on the back of the neck stand up. John Bell was confined to his bed. The once robust deacon was now a gaunt, shivering shadow of his former self. His face was perpetually contorted by involuntary muscle spasms, a condition the witch claimed credit for with a cackling, rhythmic glee. The entity, Kate, had stopped singing hymns. Her voice had turned cold, focused entirely on the destruction of the old man she called Old Jack. She would sit in the shadows of his bed curtains, whispering that his time was short, that the grave was hungry, and that she was the one digging it. On the morning of December 19th, the family went to wake John, but they found him in a deep, unnatural stupor. He was breathing, but he was unresponsive. His eyes rolled back into his head, his skin clammy and gray. John's son, John Bell Jr., went to the medicine cupboard to find his father's prescribed tonic. But when he reached for the bottle, he found it had been replaced. In its stead sat a strange, smoky green vial that no one in the family recognized. There was no label. No doctor had prescribed it. As the family crowded around the bed, confused and terrified, the air in the room began to vibrate. The voice of the witch erupted from the rafters, louder and more triumphant than ever before. "It's useless. I fixed him. I gave him a big dose out of that vial last night while he was asleep, and it has done the business for him." Terrified, John Jr. took a straw and dipped it into the mysterious green liquid. He dropped a single bead of the substance onto the tongue of the family cat. Within seconds, the animal began to convulse violently. It went into a series of horrific spasms and died on the cabin floor. The family realized with a sickening horror that the entity hadn't been just haunting them. It had physically manifested a poison and administered it to a sleeping man. They threw the vial into the fireplace, and the blue flames roared up the chimney with a roar that sounded like a scream. John Bell never regained consciousness. He breathed his last on the morning of December 20th, 1820. The horror didn't end with his death. Kate was relentless. On the day of the funeral, hundreds of people from all over the county gathered at the Red River. As the coffin was being lowered into the earth, the silence of the morning was shattered. From the trees surrounding the graveyard, the voice of the witch began to sing. It wasn't a dirge. It was a raucous, rowdy drinking song about Old Jack. The singing continued, loud and clear, until the last shovelful of dirt was placed on the grave. Only then did the voice fade into a low, mocking hiss that drifted away over the river. True to her word, once John Bell was dead, the entity's focus shifted. She continued to torment Betsy Bell until the young girl finally broke off her engagement to Joshua Gardner in 1821. Once the marriage was called off, the witch seemed satisfied. During a final visitation in the family kitchen, the entity told Lucy Bell that she was leaving, but only for a time. She promised to return in 7 years. In 1828, she kept that promise. John Bell Jr. reported that the entity returned to his home, scratching at the walls and discussing the past. But she found no one left to break. She stayed for 3 weeks and then vanished again, promising to return to John Bell's descendants in 107 years, which would have been 1935. While no murderous activity was reported then, many in the Bell bloodline still speak of a heaviness that follows them to this day. The Bell Witch remains a scar on American history because it defies the rules of hauntings. It wasn't a ghost bound to a room. It was a sentient, vocal, and physically lethal presence that interacted with the living for years. It was documented by a future president, verified by a community of skeptics, and resulted in a death certificate that many believe should have listed the unexplained as the cause of death. If you ever find yourself near Adams, Tennessee, near the site of the old farm, you can still visit the limestone cave where the entity was said to retreat. People still hear the whispers, they still feel the pokes, and they still remember the man who was hunted to death in his own home. The darkness of the past is never truly gone. It just waits for the lights to go out. If you found this deep dive into the Bell Witch haunting as chilling as I did, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the Folklord. Your support helps us keep the hearth fires burning and the stories coming. Don't forget to click that notification bell so you're alerted the next time we peel back the veil of the unknown. Until next time, keep your eyes on the shadows and stay safe in the dark.